This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam. Ian McGilchrist is the author of The Master and His Emissary, a book about the divided brain. He uses research drawn from patients who have brain damage to one hemisphere or the other, and patients who suffer from serious mental disorders. Ian argues that the left and right hemispheres of the brain have competing visions of reality, and that increasingly we live in a world dominated by the left hemisphere. I asked Ian to imagine a world where all of us only had one hemisphere, the right. What kind of a world would that produce?
The right hemisphere, if it were really without the left hemisphere, would see a lot of connections between things and would see a broad picture, but it might not be so good at focusing on details. Emotionally, the timbre might be somewhat melancholic and sad, because I think it's one of the aspects, I'm afraid, of the right hemisphere's realism and sympathy, a capacity for empathy, that it does feel suffering. We would not be able to make calculations in the same way. Most arithmetic calculations are made by the left hemisphere. So we would be good at coming up with ideas. We might not be good at actually sort of carrying out the nuts and bolts and getting it working as a machine.
Now, let's run the opposite thought experiment. What if all of us just had only a left hemisphere? What would that world look like?
Well, obviously we would lose sight of the big picture. That's the thing I've emphasized throughout. There'd be an emphasis on the details instead. There would be a great emphasis on predictability, organizability, anonymity, categorization, loss of the unique, and an ability to break things down into parts but not really see what the whole is like. There'd be a need for total control because the left hemisphere is somewhat paranoid. After right hemisphere damage, people often develop a paranoia. And that's because one can't understand quite what's going on, and one needs, therefore, to control it. Anger would become the key note in public discourse. Everything would become black and white. The left hemisphere needs to be decisive, because don't forget, it's the one that's catching the prey. It's no good going, well, yeah, it could be a rabbit, but it might not be. It's got to go, I'm going to go for it. So it likes black and white. It doesn't like shades of meaning. So in this world, we would lose the capacity to see grades of difference. We would misunderstand everything that is implicit and metaphorical and have to make rules about how to achieve it.
And it's your contention in some ways that the world that we have come to live in is a world that increasingly looks like that latter picture.
I think what I observe is an overemphasis on predetermined systems of algorithms. The sense of social alienation, the way in which we live divorced from the natural world, which is a very new phenomenon. The insistence on extreme positions, which is what the left hemisphere understands, not a nuanced argument about the pros and cons of every single thing. Meaning comes out of living in a consistent culture where there is a sense of connection with one's past, and not just one's own past, but the past of the people who made you who you are, with the other people in the society to which you belong, and to the world at large, the natural world, and things that are just simply beyond our ken, the transcendental. These are very important things that the right hemisphere is much better equipped to understand, and I feel that the loss of them in modern life is grievous.
One of the unusual things about Ian's book is that it has detailed passages about neuroscience, followed by discussions about thousands of years of art and music and literature. Ian argues that we have come to live in a world that prizes details over the big picture, what is literal over what is metaphorical. He then tries to show how these changes play out in culture. One criticism of his book by other scientists is that it steps off the ledge of science when it ventures into polemics about art and culture. I asked Ian what he made of that criticism.
Well, it depends how you look at it. If you look at it with your left hemisphere, it makes sense. If you look at it with your right hemisphere, it's nonsense. I mean, I think what it shows, and it's made typically by a certain kind of scientist who is not generally somebody who's interested in the big picture. Now, in the past, scientists couldn't leave school without having read quite a lot of history, literature, and even doing a bit of philosophy. Nowadays, it's possible to be crammed with technical information and even go into an entirely technical scientific subject. So in the past, scientists tend to take a humanistic view. They saw the import of their work in a broad context of human life. But if you spend all your life looking down a microscope at a tiny detail and hardly even know much about what's going on in the next cubicle to you, then somebody coming along and saying this has something to do with human life is very odd. But if you actually think that researching on the brain has got to have human implications, because, excuse me, the brain is something that makes it possible to be a human being, then, it's bound to have implications. So I just think it's a feeling of discomfort with, as they would put it, straying off the field.
So let me push back on you just a little bit, because I think there's an interesting rhetorical trick here. You're essentially saying that if some of the people who criticize you are criticizing you because they're overly reliant on their left hemisphere. That does come a little close to basically saying that if you criticize my idea, there's something wrong with your brain, and that essentially seals you off from criticism, doesn't it?
Well, no, I don't think it does. I know it looks like that, and I do accept that there's no way around that, because what I'm really pointing out is that I think that if you do take a narrow view, you will object to it. If you don't take a narrow view, you won't. But it's perfectly possible to criticize my thesis coherently. For example, you could take any one of the contentions in many areas across the board to do with, say, the appreciation of metaphor or creativity or facial recognition, and there are at least 20 of these. And you could say, now I look at the research, I find all these things, and you don't take them into account at all. You're wrong, mate. And then I have to go, okay. Or, can I point you to this? And I think that I can make it cohere. This is a sensible, rational conversation. But just to go, if you talk about things I don't know about, I'm going to tell you you're not welcome in the club. Well, that's not good enough.
So the book is in some ways a criticism of our increasing love and reliance on models. But as I was reading the book, I did notice that you yourself have built a very complex and compelling model here, Ian.
Indeed.
Have you ever wondered whether you yourself might be captive to your left hemisphere and you potentially now can't see the problems with your own model?
That's a very good point. I'm not critical of models, actually, in themselves. I'm critical of particular models. Because, in fact, we can't understand anything, this is one of my basic points, except by having a model with which we compare it. So that is always a limitation. We don't move from a world in which we have models to a better one in which we don't. We move from a bad model to a better one. So every model has its limitations, but some form simply a better fit, and that is what the progress of science is. It's always what I would call a gestalt. Does this gestalt, which is an overall appreciation of a whole rather than nitpicking at little details, does this, generally speaking, answer better to the picture of reality I have, and does it answer some questions that were not answered under the old model? So that is a perfectly good question to ask. I'm not blind to the problems of it. I'm open to and desirous of dialogue with people about its virtues and its vices. And if there are vices, and there undoubtedly have to be, then I appreciate being able to alter my model to incorporate this new information. So that is how science progresses.
We talked a little bit about some of the critics that you've had, but I also had a question about some of your admirers. I mean, your book has had a considerable amount of success. It's been very well received. But I do wonder whether some of the people who like the book like it in some ways because it allows them to say, the reason I'm not successful at work is because, I'm a right-brain person stuck in this workplace with all these left-brain technocrats. And it's really a way to sort of bring back the left-brain, right-brain pop psychology, this time with fMRI studies. Do you worry about that?
I think what I'm saying could be obviously misused by people who want to deceive themselves. But I do also think it may open their eyes to something that is real. For example, I have treated many patients who come into the consultation and immediately put down a mobile phone, a pager, and a third electronic appliance. And I can sense already what's wrong with them. And many of my patients, I say to them at the end, you know, it's not that there's pathology in you, it's that there's pathology in the workplace, in the corporation for which you work, and perhaps in the society to which you belong. And so I don't want you to approximate yourself more and more to what is demanded of you, because it is inhuman. It is dehumanizing, and no wonder you're feeling a bit depressed. And to be fair, what most people say to me, and I get people writing me from all walks of life all the time saying, you describe what I'm experiencing at work. What they say is not, you suddenly explained, you know, what I don't like about my job. What they say is, you've given me a whole new view of my life. Some people say, you've improved my marriage. You've made me enjoy my work better. And you've confirmed to me, this is a very common thing, you have confirmed to me something that I knew at some level, but I just didn't have the language to express. You have helped me articulate it.
Well, one of the things that's really important to mention, Ian, is that even though so much of your work is a corrective to our over-reliance on the left hemisphere, you are cautious to separate yourself from those who would say the worlds of science and reason are expendable, that those worlds don't actually give us anything of value.
Oh, absolutely the opposite. Absolutely the opposite. I love science. Since a child I was captivated by science. I depend on science in my work, and I depend on scientific discoveries for my life. The argument in my book, as people have pointed out, is sequential, analytic, and rational. In fact, people say, it's quite a left hemisphere book. And I say, good. I hope I used both my hemispheres in writing this book, because if not, it wouldn't be a very good one. So we need both. And what I feel is that science and reason depend on a balance of these things. There is a distinction to be made between rationality, by which I mean the mindless following out of rationalistic procedures, and what I would call reason, which since the Renaissance has been exalted as the mark of a truly educated person, which is to make balanced, informed judgments, but not just informed by data, but informed by an understanding in the whole context of a living being belonging to a vibrant society of what this actually means. In other words, judgment. Judgment has been taken out of our intellectual world and replaced by something a machine can do. And that may look good to a certain kind of way of thinking, but I think it's a disaster. The right hemisphere sees the need of the left. That's in the image of the master and the emissary, the master knowing the need for the emissary not knowing the value of the master. And if I may use a quotation from Einstein, I think this gives us the full picture. He said that the rational mind is a faithful servant. The intuitive mind is a precious gift. We live in a society that honors the servant, but has forgotten the gift.